And we are back. It's 8:37 on a Tuesday edition of the Neal Larson Show. Julie Mason now in studio with me. Welcome back, Julie.
Thank you.
And we have George Mena in with us.
We do. He's going to be such a wonderful guest. We've had a chance to just sit and chat with him. He's the author of My American Transformation. And it's a book that reads like a journal. It is small, short stories that he said he wrote for his 6 sons. So we're so grateful to have you here, George.
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. It's been a while since I was here last talking about the death of Fidel Castro.
You know, first of all, that interview, George, one of the most overwhelming responses we've had here at KID, very, very positive response. But how long ago was that? When did Fidel Castro die?
It's about 2 years ago.
About 2 years ago.
About 2 years ago.
Anyway, you and I said that's one of the most compelling interviews I've ever done, but not because of me. Your story is so powerful.
Thank you.
Maybe before we get into the book here, My American Transformation, kind of recap your history and the years you spent in Cuba and your escape.
I left when I was 12 years old. When I was 7 years old, something drastic happened. My father fell out of grace with the government. He was not a political man. He just believed, as most of us do, that if you work hard and you create your own enterprise, it should not be taken away from you. So he rebelled against the government a bit and ended up being taken away from the family. And the same day, my mom was taken away from us. I came home from school, and they were gone. My parents were gone. And the only person at home was my almost 4-year-old brother. And in that, we had no idea where my parents were. Eventually, my mom escaped, came back, and let us know where she was. And soon thereafter, my father became injured, and he managed to bribe a government official who enabled us to buy another family's exit visa because ours had been already sold. So that's how we came to the States with a deep appreciation for the fact that we had a new beginning in a land where we could enjoy the freedoms that were taken away from us in our own country.
You know, when you contrast those two lives, so you were 12 when you left.
Mm-hmm.
You had enough years that you remember it well.
Oh, absolutely.
Compare that, and I think we know where this is going, but and obviously there's a big difference, but compare your life in Cuba to what you were able to do here in America.
Well, it all started when we landed. My parents were, and my father was not a religious man, my mom was at that time. We got off the plane, and suddenly there was a hush, and I looked back, and my father and mother were on their knees praying. That's something that they could have gone to jail for in Cuba. So we experienced that freedom immediately, and the boundless opportunities that this country offers, and opportunities that no other country really offers. The freedoms that we enjoy here, we very often take for granted. People don't realize that we can lose them if we don't protect them.
Yeah. So after the interview with KID a couple of years ago in the wake of Fidel Castro's death, you had been working on your series of essays, My American Transformation, but you actually heard from people who were kind of in disbelief about your experience.
They could not believe that a government could just come to your house and take your parents away and leave a 7-year-old and a almost 4-year-old by themselves. And again, I think it all boils down to the perspective that each one of us has to reference what goes on around us. We in our mindset in the U.S., that would be impossible. It doesn't happen. The government has a role of parens patriae, meaning that they take care of their citizens. Well, in communism, socialism, the intent of the government when you disagree is to punish you as severely as they possibly can. And that's something that we've never experienced, and hopefully will never experience.
Is that in order to keep everybody else in line?
Oh, absolutely.
So everyone sees how vicious that is, so they don't want to go there.
Oh, yeah. We were taken away, and the neighbors were told, don't feed the kids, don't talk to them, or you'll be next. So we were isolated. No one could come to our rescue, so to speak.
Yeah.
If you could have a conversation with even Bernie Sanders or a follower of Bernie Sanders who is extolling the virtues of socialism, what would you say to them?
You're mistaken. You obviously have no way of really knowing what you're talking about because you've not experienced it. Everything looks good on paper, but when you live through it, you realize that it is not the advertisement that you saw on the publication or the TV. It's completely different. I was telling Neal before the interview that he was speaking about quid pro quo. In socialism, in communism, there is a quid pro quo, a something for something else. And the price is the loss of liberty, the loss of freedom. Everything that Senator Warren and Bernie is offering, or are offering, are impossible to actually execute because whose money are you going to use? Where is that money going to come from? How are you going to pay for all these things? And the myth of equality that we know for a fact has happened in every communist country. When you make everyone equal, as they perceive it to be equal, you make everyone equally miserable, equally poor, equally despondent, because there is no incentive for them to better themselves, in part because they are not allowed to do so.
Let's talk more about your book, your series of essays called My American Transformation. Just tell us about it.
It started as a sort of a collection of essays to leave for my children, my sons, and my grandkids, so that they would know what their father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and grandmother experienced coming to the States. And then also, I mean, the first three essays have to do with those horrible experiences in Cuba and leaving Cuba, but everything beyond that is about the greatness of this country, the ability that, the opportunity that if you work hard, if you're committed to succeed, no one really can stop you. There are so many opportunities at every turn. Now, you have to work for them. They're not given to you. But no one can stop you if you're determined to succeed and be what you believe will make you the best you that you can be.
George, and I love that message. We just got the book. I haven't had a chance to read through all of it, and I can't wait to do that. You mentioned, it took you a while to do this, because there's one portion of it that was incredibly difficult. This was not just a light effort for you. It was an emotional hurdle for you as well as a writing accomplishment.
It was not intended to be a book for the public. One of the chapters is still very difficult for me to even read or revisit, and it has to do with the night when we left Cuba. One of the things that the government, the Cuban government, did to punish those who were leaving the island was that frequently there were mistakes on the exit documents that were given to those of us who were coming to the U.S. under the freedom flights as Cuban refugees. And my father had a typo on his exit papers. There was also a young family, and the father also had the same type of typo. His last name started with an H, I believe. Hernandez, I believe, was his last name. And that family was destroyed because they said, well, the family can go, the daughter and the wife, but you can't, sir, because there's a problem with your documents. So this young man was physically removed, and I guess I've always felt survivor's guilt that that little girl who kept us sane all night lost her dad. And because of him, when it was my turn, my father's turn to turn his documents in, the representative of the U.S. government, who was attached to the U.S. interest section of the Swiss embassy, distracted the Cuban officer, engaging him in some ridiculous argument about big leagues over Cuban baseball, and kind of had the Cuban officer stamped the documents without reading them. And that was, I still relive that. I mean, if it were possible, that's one memory I wish I could delete from my mind's eye, but I can't. And it was, every time and it's one of the earliest essays, and I couldn't, I would start on it and think, well, I'm going to get past it, but I couldn't.
George, your book is called My American Transformation. Very, very good title. How do people get a hold of a copy of this book?
It's on Amazon.com. It's on Barnes & Noble, just about every bookstore that I can think of. Amazon and Barnes & Noble would be the obvious choices, I think.
I want to talk more about this. I think around the world, think of the stories that we're covering, we've been covering, not we KID, but just as a news media.
Sure.
And as a global population, you look at what's happening with Hong Kong and communist China right now. We know what happened in Venezuela. Still a mess there. There's not as much news coverage of it, but it's still a big mess that's going on there. It just seems so. The evidence is so abundantly overwhelming that these collectivist ideologies, they don't end well. They may start out and look great at the beginning, but they seem to almost always end in a Venezuela or communist China cracking down on anybody who wants their freedom. Why is there this fascination with collectivist ideology? What draws people to that?
Years ago, we used to talk about responsibilities. Today, we talk about privilege. And I think that, unfortunately, our culture has evolved into one of entitlements where we want to be, well, not we, many people want to be taken care of and believe that the government can do that better than themselves. It's a fallacy. It's never worked. It'll never work. If you don't have an incentive for people in a free environment to challenge themselves to become better and achieve more, how is that going to function? If I give the example of my nephew in Cuba, he wanted to be a computer guy. He wanted to be an IT programmer. Well, the government said we need welders. So guess what he's doing? He's welding ships. My sister, who still lives in Cuba, and by the way, is a well-known communist, she's my half-sister, and we talk periodically because we're family. She wanted to become a doctor. She became a lawyer because that's what the government needed, eventually a judge. And then when she reached 61, they said, you have to retire. So she retired. And then 6 months later, they said, but we need you to come back and volunteer. So,
yeah.
So when those freedoms are taken away from you, your ability to dream is crushed. You really don't have agency over your own life.
How's Cuba doing? I haven't heard a lot about Cuba lately, and I know you still have some family there?
Yeah, my half-sister and my nephew, and then everyone on my father's side. It's still horrible, still miserable. They've allowed a little bit of internet to very specific people, but it's censored and not... So I've heard somebody say, "Oh, they have internet in Cuba now." It's not the same as what we have here.
Yeah.
Like when they speak about, well, Cuba has free medical for everyone. Well, the quality of healthcare is completely different. It's not the same as what we have here.
Yeah. All right. George Mena is our guest. It's 8:52. We're going to take a quick break here. We'll come back and have another segment. If you have a question for George, send us a text to 208-522-5900. Again, the name of his book, his collection of essays, is called My American Transformation, and you can find it wherever books are sold. We'll be back with another segment after this on KID.